Thank you all for being here. Carol, thanks for the invitation to speak here. And I know some of you. I don't know all of you. I do see at least 2 or 3 now of the opponents of Westway who fought the battles and lived them and also helped me find documents. So I'm happy to see Marcy Benstock, who just walked in, and Bunny Gable here, the citizen opponents, Walter Mugden from the Environmental Protection Agency, who was one of the tenacious legal battlers on this project. But I assume from talking, and know from talking to some of you, that not everyone knows what Westway was about. And part of my interest in this project was the following. So people knew that there was this thing called Westway. They know that there was some battle over Westway. And in talking to people, and myself as a young professor, and also earlier as a lawyer, everyone seemed to have conflicting views about what Westway was about, what the stakes were in the battle, and then in the end, really whether its defeat in 1985 was a good thing or a bad thing. And frankly, even further, the very legal underpinnings of the battle are very much contested in ways that I'll discuss. And so, people say, like, well, who cares? This is some little highway project. The scale of the Westway project was mammoth, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment. But it was, in its day, maybe akin to the Keystone XL pipelines today, in that it was a battle that had local impacts but was a nationally viewed battle that was reported across the nation, was the subject of congressional hearings, numerous regulatory skirmishes, state, local, and federal. And hence it really was a huge battle. It also involved issues such as the role of the law constraining politics, but also politics at times overwhelming the law's usual strictures, and also with substantial battles about the role of science. So there is this thing called climate change that most of us think is actually happening, and if you think about the very battlegrounds of the Westway battle, there too there are a lot of echoes in contemporary battles over climate change regulation. So very interesting to me. But here's what I'm going to do in the talk. I'm going to first just show you a little bit of what Westway was, assuming some of you have no idea. Then talk a little bit about who the stakeholders were, with a picture or two. And then I'm going to step back and then talk a little more about why I decided to write this book. As a professor, we teach classes and grade exams and grade more exams. But we also get the latitude of choosing projects that interest us as scholars. And so, I decided this was a project that was worth digging into, and I wanted to just talk about why I found it interesting. And then I'm going to, at the last part, I'm going to step back and kind of talk through the battles, the major stages of the battles, and let you know a little more about this. As part of it, I will also kind of frame for you some of the key contested claims about Westway that will perhaps illuminate for you why people care a lot. So first, when I graduated from law school in 1986, and also then worked as a lawyer during the summers prior to that. And even then, before the Westway battle ended, people would say, don't forget what we learned from Westway. And that was always interesting, except that people always said completely different things about it. There was virtually no agreement about what those lessons were. And it also became apparent that just a huge number of people had worked on this project. And so, there were, where's the right button? Here it is. So, there were a few things that people can agree on. So one is, if you see this here, this is the old elevated West Side Highway, also known as the Miller Highway, and that was had some problems. And so one of them, it was deteriorating. That's a truck over there on the right. There is a question why there was a truck with heavy material on a highway that was closed because it was decrepit. And so whether it was, as some people thought, perhaps a stunt or just something that was really stupid, this picture was prominently used to say, really, we have to do something to replace this highway. And so the proposal was, this is from, I think, a 1953 picture from the air. It's not from one of the tall skyscrapers you perhaps saw over here. Battery Park City, where we're standing now, is essentially over here, and the World Trade Centers were subsequently built there. But the piers that you see jutting out, which go like sometimes 800 to close to 1,000 feet out, that wrap up there, that entire space is where the Westway project was designated to be built. And this will give you a feel for it. This is from one of the environmental impact statements. And there you can see the Battery Park City area to the west and southwest of the World Trade Centers. And then you can see wrapping up to the little south end, the Midtown area, what was one of the largest landfilling proposed operations in the history of man. Okay? A massive project. And it was described as a highway development and park project, sometimes also called redevelopment project. But because most of this was pier, and then there was some roadside edge of it, actually a lot of it was new development. Also, something to note here in this picture, although it was slightly tweaked in some minor aspects in subsequent years, this largely ended up being the configuration, the landmass. And you'll notice that although it was described as a highway, you're probably wondering, where's the highway? The highway was to be tunneled for much of it, with several exchanges coming out. One of the exchanges would have largely destroyed the Gansevoort market, where now all of you hang out and have terrific food. And then so it was buried for much of its distance with periodic interchanges that would allow people to go in or escape it. And then you may also notice that a lot of it is white and only some of it is green. Okay? And so although the proponents of Westway, and you'll see they were very powerful proponents, kept emphasizing more and more this was a necessary highway and a park project, it actually had more land slated for the white stuff, and that was for real estate development. Okay? There was more land slated for real estate development than was slated for park, not by a huge amount of acreage, but it was the majority, or the majority of the surface area was for new real estate development. And although this thing was fought from 1971 to 85, never could you find a crystal clear description of who was going to be doing the developing, selling, profiting from it. One thing became clear in the 1980s, and that was that New York City would have the steering wheel, essentially, in deciding who and how it would be developed. But even there, exactly the form of it, that remained unclear, making it a little difficult for people to know exactly what they were battling over, since the majority of the land use wasn't clear. There were some images of it that showed actually very low structures, kind of sketched out, moving along here. But that was basically the project. So again, just to see the mass of it, this was, the overall project was, I believe, about a little over 4 miles, and the part that was in the water was about 2.8 miles. Okay? And so one other thing about the project, as proposed, that is, under the official estimate, it was per inch, per mile, per foot, whatever you want to say. It was the most expensive highway ever proposed by man. Okay? Now that was at the official estimate, which went up to about $2 billion. But everyone, both in internal documents and when I interviewed people, everyone kind of thought it clearly would go into the $6 to $10 billion range. And when I was interviewing another person who would not let me say who it was, but someone who was, I'll just say, a prominent person on the government side, not a battler, but someone who was more on the construction side, he said, well, if you look at the Big Dig in Boston, and you look at the complexity of a sunken highway in the former river, he thought it really probably would have gone as high as $20 to $30 billion. Okay? Because the Big Dig in Boston was, I think, estimated initially at about $4 billion and ended up costing $15, and he thought similar escalations had happened here. People like Craig Whitaker, who's one of the planners of this, he thinks actually the engineering was less complicated. He thinks that number is off. So I don't know, but everyone agrees this was an extraordinarily expensive project, an extraordinarily massive project. Now, right away, one issue was why build this? Okay, now, for those of you who are movie buffs, and you know that around 1971, every movie that showed New York seemed to show the same things. It would be the graffiti-laden subways, right, roving gangs, and a city that was struggling, right, and it was struggling. And so this was a massive amount of money that was to flow into it. But who was going to pay? This was interstate highway funds, federal dollars, so all taxpayers across the United States would have paid for this project. And the explicit goal was to bring maximum dollars into New York. And again, this is not like a hidden goal, just to be clear. This was a conceded part of the plan from the get-go, okay, to bring in a huge amount of money into a struggling city that would be a kind of fiscal uplift. And when I interviewed Mayor Koch, he said, to bring in 90% federal funds cost to completion, meaning even with cost escalations, 90%, he thought would be a huge economic boost to the city. And he also said the following. He said, among other things, he said, he's a talkative guy, but among other things, he said, we would never have built this on our own. This project was absolutely only possible because of federalist support for the interstate highway funding. But people still criticize it. People said, why are you building a highway in a city dependent on mass transit? And as initially built, the interstate highway dollars could only be used for interstate highway. And so one of the things I'll talk about is that changed, in part because of Westway. Now, but right away, some people were saying, some were calling it a work of genius, others a boondoggle, a pork barrel project. And so people basically had different views. Let me give you a couple other sense of perspective. This is lest you don't figure this out on your own, that's a model, okay? The Hudson has never been that placid. But so this is one of the piers jutting out, and it would have been replaced with something like that. So it gives you a cross section with the tunneled highway and then some park above it in places, okay? I'm trying to remember if that's the only one. Yeah, well, I'll show you that in a second. So, so again, 2.8 miles going across, largest filling operation. Now, before I talk about the stakes and also the competing claims about it, who was for it, who was against it? Okay, I always kind of think sports metaphors help, right? Who are on the teams? So on the pro-Westway side, you had, depending on how you count it, 3 or 4 presidents of the United States. President Nixon effectively was president when this got rolling. I couldn't find any indication that he himself particularly knew about or weighed in on Westway. But then you had subsequent presidents. You had Ford, who allowed the planning to continue. Then you had Carter, who also allowed this to continue, and his heads of departments were in favor of it. And ultimately, Reagan. That's who you're seeing there in the middle. That's not a plastic statue. That is, in fact, the man who has recently reported said of his autobiography, I look forward to reading it someday. And then you have Ed Koch, for those of you who don't know Ed Koch. Mario Cuomo, the man in the back with the glasses. He is a full-size person. That's Raymond Donovan, the Secretary of the Department of Labor. You have Al D'Amato on the far right. The person in the orange shirt was reported to be a union worker. And then behind it you have Senator Moynihan. Okay? And what they're holding there is a check that says $85 million. That was a small installment of the money that would have flowed into the city. And you can see the poster behind it, right? The basic claims, right? Bringing in jobs, revitalization, improved transportation, development, and acres of new parkland. Okay? And so on the other side, so you had fairly powerful people. I should also add that most unions supported the project. In addition, the New York Times editorial board supported Westway vehemently and for a long time. New York Times op-ed writers often opposed it, which we'll talk about in a few minutes if I'm doing okay on time. That's right. And then the Daily News, I believe, was in favor of it generally. The Village Voice was opposed. But on the other side, you had a powerful, powerful team. Okay, there we go. So here you have none other than Marcy Benstock, who is still recognizable today, sitting there in the back row. So, okay, and she was, and I'll talk about in a second, despite her modesty and it viewed by others quite clearly, including Mayor Koch, as the most important kind of leader of the citizen opposition. You have Bunny Gable here, who with Friends of the Earth, are just sitting next to her there. And then I think someone told me that Dan is one of those pictures. I'm not sure some of the other characters, but in the back, you have, in the silver hair, you have David Brower, the famous environmentalist from Friends of the Earth. And then next to him, a guy with some of the best sideburns I've ever seen, and I have no idea who that is. But others have not been able to identify him for me. But I think he might have been in Jaws as the captain, but I'm not sure. But in any event, these were the citizen opponents who, in the end, with some of the environmental groups they were part of, worked in opposition to Westway from 1971 to 85. Okay? And so other people came and went, and I think perhaps importantly, on the proponent side, the supporter side, people came and went, but the opponents, both these people and then in the regulatory and legal arena, a few lawyers in particular, were the people who stuck with the battle during that whole time. And in this picture, they're on the Clearwater, Pete Seeger's boat, and this was a fundraiser. There's some other people who I didn't talk to as much. I'm sure we fill it in later if people want to know. But so it was really, as you think about the people on the pro side, this was really a juggernaut. I should add that David Rockefeller was a strong supporter of the project, and he and others set up kind of umbrella groups whose whole reason for being was to advocate for Westway. And so on the other side, you had a small number of citizens and their lawyers. I'll give you, when I interviewed Ed Koch, I didn't have to mention any names to him, and even though it was more than a decade later, he said of Marcy Benstock, as quoted in the book, he said, "She was the brains of the outfit. They were very smart. To defeat Westway, they had to beat the unions and the banks and the advocates for Westway." Nevertheless, at 1985, the project was defeated. Okay, and so now the question is, why was it defeated, right? So you kind of have the idea of the stakes, the magnitude of the project. How could this juggernaut of extremely powerful people wanting something that promised huge amounts of money to New York defeat the project? And I'll say that as, so we know it was defeated, but there are kind of several prominent stories about Westway that I kept encountering. And so I'll just kind of lay them out for you a little bit, then come back to the end and tell you which I think in the end are confirmed. And so one story was small number of citizens taking something on that this was effectively democracy hijacked, okay? That this was in some way the defeat of democracy because basically, the political leaders wanted this and citizens opposing this were sort of hijacking democracy. Okay, that's one claim. Now others view this as very much the opposite, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Another prominent theme, and part of the reason Westway is still mentioned today and why a reporter called me up a few weeks ago about the Keystone Pipeline and said, "Tell me about Westway, tell me about this, what are the parallels, what are the similarities, what are the lessons," is there is, environmental law, as you may have noticed, is very much in the crosshairs of people who view environmental law as a misguided project that threatens America's progress, that threatens jobs, and that is essentially just too much and does too little. And Westway is one of those examples that people bring up, the claim that this was a huge project defeated for no good reason. So I'll just call that environmental law gone wrong. And as part of that, there are a couple little phrases that kept coming up. One is a project killed by bureaucrats and regulations. Okay, and the other was killed over a procedural snafu, okay, or a procedural error. And some people also talked about a hostile judge. Okay, and so it ended up, you notice all those themes tie in with the anti-democracy. They're kind of small numbers fighting something for no reason, kind of portraying it a little bit as a NIMBY sort of, not in my backyard sort of battle. And I gave a talk in Washington about this recently, and someone said, well, when I read about this in college, people presented it as the ultimate NIMBY battle. And I said, well, let's talk about it, and broke it down and showed why I think that's wrong. Okay. Now, on the other side, people looked at Westway's flaws and risks as substantial, and that they violated a number of substantive legal protections, and you needed to think about that. And we'll talk about that more. Now, the third claim, which is also important, is you may have noticed this also, that especially in the Supreme Court, but also in Congress, citizen activism, both political activism and citizen empowerment in the courts, is very much under attack these days. The idea that citizens can stand up against powerful political leaders and say illegal, wrong, and bad idea is viewed by some as really a problem. And as I interviewed various people and looked at the documents, this was a prominent theme in the Westway battle. So again, the three kind of main contested claims, like contested democracy claims, environmental law gone right or wrong, and then the third, is our citizens and their involvement a good or bad things. And I should add citizens and their lawyers. Can you imagine that anyone would dislike a lawyer? I mean, frankly, I find it shocking. But, okay. So now I said I'd talk briefly before I get into the battle about why I wanted to write this project. Okay? And so I'll just be kind of quick here about this. But those of you who write about or read about law at all, or law and politics, yeah, you probably are aware there are books like Aaron Brockovich or Civil Action that tell you about toxic tort types of cases, right? Cases where people are injured, they try to recover money, okay? So there are battles like that, and certainly there are books about civil rights history that show kind of how people strategically fought and ultimately dismantled things like segregation and some of the institutionalized racism in the United States. There is no book out there, well, there wasn't a book out here, that existed that would take on a high-stakes regulatory battle and give you a window into how people fight these kinds of battles strategically. And so as I looked at Westway, I thought, this is itself interesting, because I kind of wanted to know, you know, when I dug into it, what was I going to find about why it was defeated, which of these competing claims were right. But I also thought, and maybe I can at another level kind of educate people about how law and politics intersect in these high-stakes regulatory battles that go on all the time. And so I decided I'd try to do both of these. And just in case you're wondering, if is this an old battle? Do the issues matter? Okay. Does money still influence law and politics? Check, right? Okay. Second, are government actors still themselves buffeted by a complicated set of legal, financial, and scientific calculations in high-stakes battles? Absolutely, right? Do agencies sometimes battle with each other? All the time, okay? Do regulatory decision makers have to act at the bounds of science? That is, where knowledge is uncertain. Still happens today, okay? And then do the laws still take sides in some of these battles and choose the nation's priorities? Absolutely. And then are citizens still big actors? Absolutely. And so I thought, you know, this is an old battle, but the things that were going on here are still very much relevant. And just to give you a feel for one little side story, a few years ago I was talking to a bunch of environmentalists and environmental lawyers from China who were traveling the United States and trying to understand our legal system. And so I and some other people at other schools were giving them talks about different elements. And I told them about U.S. enforcement and drew a little bit on the Westway research that I was still doing at that point. And they were kind of stunned. And they said, as a Bulgarian student once teaching in Europe said to me, they effectively said, wait, you're saying that citizens can go something that's wanted by several presidents in a row, governors, mayors, that they can fight a project that the governmental leaders want, and they can have the law enforced? I said, yes, that's possible. And this one guy from Bulgaria said, in Bulgaria, you cannot do that. But one of the visiting people from China raised his hand, and he said, and other people looked like, I think this person was probably a windbag, but because other people kind of go, oh. But he raised his hand, and I called on him, and he said, in China, the law is like a beautiful picture. And everyone kind of goes, what? He goes, it's a beautiful picture. You can put it on the wall, you can look at it, but you cannot take it down and use it. Okay? and everyone else, woo! And they all were incredibly entertained by this answer. And so Westway is an example of how in the United States the law can be used, how it can be wielded. And that is itself something we may take for granted, but in much of the world it's not the case. And so, you know, all law and all politics are essentially an ongoing experiment. And that is one of the experiments that the Westway battles kind of illuminate, or so I think. So let me just turn now. So what happened? Okay, I'm not telling you. Get the book. No, but well, one of the stories was the kind of democracy story, and so I'm going to talk more about the particulars of the law. But this is perhaps the most clearly wrong claim. Okay, so from the very get-go in the battle, it was contested. So even when it was proposed right away, there were a few meetings where people were trying to vet what was going on, and Bunny Gable and others showed up, but very quickly were saying this is a bad idea. And at first, as she said, and I interviewed her and a few others, she said, you know, at first we kind of thought by giving voice to it that might be enough, but then not seemed much, you know, very little changed. But one of the interesting elements here is a number of people said, oh, that must have been a Robert Moses project. And no, it was not a Robert Moses project. And what Robert Moses said about this, in this dim light, I think I can read it. I won't read all this quote. But I found in the Bella Abzug archives at Columbia University a leaflet that apparently Moses had. He was like weakened in his power at this point, early 70s, but still headed some of the development authorities. And he had a leaflet printed up with glossy pictures and essentially a multiple-page screed against Westway. And I'll just give you a few of his quotes. So he said first, how do sane West Side argufiers hope to capture a big federal highway handout for a 4-mile West Side highway certainly costing $1.5 billion. I am for public works, he sure was, and for government and within government aid within reason. But my imagination is staggered by the demand of a 90 or even 50% handout at Washington for a racetrack highway on the west side of Manhattan. And then he goes on, showing this guy really could speak and write. How much longer can such a shindig go on? 5 years? 10 years? This is not orderly consideration. It is a mob dividing up stage money, an anvil chorus, a byword, a hissing and a yapping, a spectacle of bamboozlement. If this is the road to progress, I am the retired Gaekwar of Baroda. No, the Gaekwar of Baroda, who I looked up, I think was a leader from India. It's an obscure reference, but he goes on and says, if this is, he says, no responsible West Siders in my acquaintance will much longer countenance such brouhaha. Okay, so no, he was not in favor of the project, and in fact, actually, then you may think, so I told you that Mayor Koch supported the project, but when he ran for mayor, he ran as an ardent opponent of it. When Hugh Carey ran for mayor, he ran as a diehard opponent of it, and in fact, in the President Carter archives, there was a memo to the president saying this. It said, the mayor, the governor, and the senators want it, and every other elected representative from Manhattan opposes this project. Okay, and so the idea that it was all a one-sided thing, it is the case that the leaders wanted it, but this idea that it was a one-sided battle is clearly wrong. In addition, there were polls taken, and at a later point, which I'll describe what happened, the polls showed that actually most New Yorkers did not favor Westway over what became the leading alternatives. Now, I'll just give one little quote, then I'll talk about what happened. Now, when I interviewed Koch, I said to him, playing naive, I said, why mayor? When you were in Congress, you ran, when you were in Congress running for mayor, you said that it was an ecological disaster. What happened? And so he looked at me with a humorous, withering look, and he said, first he said, David Rockefeller and the unions importuned me to reconsider. Okay, so that was his word. They importuned him to reconsider. And then he said, and as a mayor, I had to think about being in good relationships with Hugh Carey. And Hugh Carey at that point was also a supporter of Westway. But he also said the following, okay, and so, for those who kind of follow the literature on what motivates development, there's a literature saying that local governments tend to be really overwhelmingly motivated by favoring development. They need the jobs, they need the revenue, and they tend to push for development sort of inexorably. And there's a famous professor at Harvard named Paul Peterson who's written about this in particular. And without prompting, when Koch gave me another withering look, he said the following. And this is exactly what he said. It's a pretty good quote. He said, some cities have gold mines, other cities have car plants, other cities have steel mills. New York City's main contribution in terms of generating jobs is development. Development is very important in New York City. It is an industry for us. So while I am not for irresponsible development and I am not for uncontrolled development, I am for development. Okay? And that's, in fact, what happened. There was a few times where he wavered when there were battles over mass transit, but subway fares, actually, with the governor, but he remained a strong supporter. But still, as you think about it, you had these strong people. How could they fight this project, right? So at first, it was all about, this is the third part, just like what happened. So as I said, this was an interstate highway project. Well, one of the first things that happened, and I don't have a picture of her here, but whoops, that's the extra mic, sorry. But I'll let you see the opponents since they're here today. One of the first things that happened was Bella Abzug was in Congress, and in particular in Massachusetts, there were representatives and the governor. They had interstate highway funds for a project that had hit a buzzsaw of opposition in Boston. And they didn't want to spend it on the highway, but there was no way to do anything about it. So Governor Sargent and Alan Altshuler is now a professor. He was acting as staff, I think, to Jerry Studs, I think, as a young congressman then. They proposed, or started proposing, that there would be a trade-in, that cities and states could trade interstate highway dollars for mass transit. And Bella Abzug joined in this effort, as did Ed Koch, who was in Congress, as did Hugh Carey, who was in Congress. And they, and in fact, the battle started. Now, the highway lobby is extraordinarily powerful in Congress, always has been and still is. And so around this time, cities started fighting for several things. One is to be allowed to use interstate highway funds in cities. They got that right. But then they wanted to have the right to trade in. And they fought for this. They didn't succeed. They came close. And then finally they did succeed in getting the law changed so they could trade highway funds for mass transit. And then Bella Abzug worked for 3 subsequent amendments where she was really the lead advocate, first allowing cost escalations to be taken into account. So with inflation, it was a high inflation time, if you just traded in for the value, that very quickly would have little value. So she changed it so there were a couple benchmarks, but really so it could be traded in for something close to its real estimated value. And so that was important. So that was the inflation adjustment, critically important. And then they also changed it so it could be used flexibly. So it didn't have to be just mass transit, but it could be used for a replacement road or other things like bike paths and the like. And that gave cities greater flexibility and led to a much larger coalition supporting that, and that passed as well. So right from the beginning, by 1973 to 74, as these amendments happened, Westway was no longer highway or nothing. It was highway versus mass transit. Okay? And this, once that happened, when polls were taken, do you build Westway, do you trade it for mass transit? A majority of New Yorkers opposed Westway and preferred the trade-in for mass transit. And so that was critically important. And that was a motivator. John Zuccotti, who was the deputy mayor, according to Peter Kiernan, who was a lobbyist for New York working in Washington, he said that Zuccotti said to him, he said, when this last amendment happened, he said, you just killed Westway. He said that basically having this trade-in option was going to motivate people, and he said, predicted correctly, that this would be one of the things that would imperil the project. But Kieran said, he said, you just killed Westway. Now, so that's one very important thing. Now, the second thing that happened, as you might recall, the environmental movement had basically come to the fore in the early 1970s, and you had a slew of environmental laws passed. Okay? And there were 3 very important laws passed that ended up being central to what happened with Westway. There was the National Environmental Policy Act, that's the Environmental Impact Statement Law. You had the Clean Water Act, which has strong prohibitions on dredge and fill, essentially filling in waters of the United States. That includes the Hudson, just in case you were wondering. And then you also have the Clean Air Act, which basically especially protects areas with degraded air and requires efforts to improve the air. And so what happened was these 3 laws in conjunction created the battlegrounds on the legal front. In the meantime, the citizen opponents, I won't go into all these things, were fighting this, trying to get New York all along to trade in the project once they had that right. So that was never ending. They were fundraising. There were several efforts in Congress to do various things, including one infamous project, an amendment rider in Congress called an Amendment for the Protection of Striped Bass. I was deeply moved to read about it. The only thing is, what it actually was an amendment to allow Westway to be built, but without naming Westway, but describing it so it only applied to Westway, and it would have allowed pretty much for the destruction of the area and the start of the project. So Marcy Benstock and others raced to Washington and fought the project and fought off that appropriation rider. So Westway was still subject to the law in an ordinary way. And so, so then the battle turned to, the first real battle focused on air impacts, right? And so people said, highway project, air impacts, and Walter Mugden here was working for the Environmental Protection Agency, and he was aligned with, I'll show you there, Al Butzel. And so Al Butzel was representing the citizen opponents and other environmental groups as a lead counsel in years of battling over air impacts. And Walter Mugden representing EPA. At that point, agencies were given pretty good latitude to pursue what they thought was best policy, and EPA lawyers actually sat at the opponent's table, while on the other side you had the planners of the state and the Federal Highway Administration and the rest advocating for the project. So you had United States versus United States, effectively, mostly in a state tribunal that was enforcing federal law. And so what happened there? Well, they fought the project, they fought it hard, and in fact discovered that there were some serious errors in the numbers being used about traffic impacts, parking, what this would do to air impacts. And lo and behold, the project was defeated after an administrative trial with an administrative judge sitting there, Al Rosenthal, who subsequently was the dean at Columbia Law School, by no means himself a rabid environmentalist, actually a fairly stuffy fellow, but very, very smart guy. And he looked at the evidence, he looked at the cases, he found inconsistencies and read the data and said this project cannot be built under federal law. And then that went up to the head of the Department of Environmental Conservation, and that too confirmed or affirmed that decision. But what happened subsequently, several replacements of people in leadership roles, and Fritz Schwartz, who was representing the state interests at that point, was a lawyer at Cravath, Swaine & Moore. He basically said to his clients, we have to go back and do this again. And according to him, and as I talk about in the book, Hugh Carey berated him saying, you've got to fight this thing hard now. And he said, you can do that, but it won't be with Cravath, Swaine & Moore representing New York, because you'll be defeated. And he said what you need to do back is go back, get the numbers right, do the analysis, and find a way to address these air issues. And that's what they did, and they came up with something called the Briar Patch solution, which effectively made it so no one would be subject to concentrated air pollutants at exits from Westway. And people could not at that point find an Achilles heel in the air impacts, and there was no appeal of that decision because they didn't think they had a legal hook. Okay? But several years had gone by, and there are several things that went on, but the environmental impact statement, which ties into the Clean Water Act permit, said the following about the Hudson. Okay? And it says here, floating debris is common along the west side waterfront. The environmental impact statement also talked about boils of oil and fecal matter rising to the surface periodically. And the environmental impact statement documents describe the area as a biological wasteland and biologically impoverished, and described crustaceans and other small creatures as living there. And it was only a few paragraphs of analysis. But the problem here was the following. That was probably consistent with a lot of people's intuitive feelings. But there was two problems. One is the actual underlying technical data, where they had done some surveying, showed this to be wrong. Okay? And some people began to get wind of that. And then the National Marine Fisheries Service, NMFS, another federal agency, wrote a very powerful critique of this claim in comments on whether the Army Corps should grant this permit. And they basically laid out how this was wrong, how the striped bass fishery had huge economic value, how it was imperiled. There were federal laws passed specially to protect the striped bass. And basically everyone was educated by this very lengthy regulatory document prepared by lawyers and scientists that showed that this was flat out incorrect. So you would think the Army Corps perhaps would have said, whoops, okay? But they didn't. And in fact, what happened was internal documents showed a lot of internal criticism, and then the Army Corps just kind of at one point, the person who was heading up this region just signed the permit. But basically people began to hear about this. Chuck Warren, who was the regional administrator for EPA, said to Al Butzel, something they both recalled in fairly substantially similar terms, but he said, the Air Act battles, I'm not sure you're going to win there, but don't, check out the water issues. And he said, look especially at the NMFS document, which he and others did. And basically, into court they went. Okay? And this was a strangest for, that's Mitchell Bernard, I'll get to him in a second. They went before Judge Grisey, Southern District of New York judge, famous for having a very inquisitorial style on the bench. He will grill people. A lot of judges will sit back. He very much doesn't sit back and will interrogate witnesses quite vigorously. One of the interesting quirks here, how many of you I know we have one lawyer. Any other lawyers present? Okay, 1.5. I don't know what that means, but okay, well, that's a lawyer. Come on, of course. So
we're half lawyer, half human being.
Yeah, it doesn't get better than law professor. Trust me. But basically, one of the normal things, you normally do not get a trial on regulatory decisions. Normally, people just brief whether the decision is justified. but the government's claims of biological impoverishment and wasteland and nothing there were so demonstrably false that the United States itself agreed they needed a trial. And so the first trial on water issues was with the concession of the Department of Justice, where they thought maybe they could kind of bootstrap themselves into justifying their decision. But that ran into a problem when this early version of a PowerPoint presentation. This is actually the trial exhibit found in the National Archives. And when you looked at the data for striped bass, where Westway was to go, it was the place young striped bass like to hang out more than anything else in the entire Hudson River estuary, in fact, more than any place in Long Island Sound or even outside in the ocean in some other testing grounds. Striped bass like this area. My theory, mind you, I don't have confirmation of this, was striped bass like music. You had the Talking Heads, you had the Police, you had a lot of great music in the Village and Soho, and that they wanted to be close to it. They were young, what can you expect? So I don't know if that's the case. But in any event, a scientist named Ian Fletcher prepared this with Al Butzel, and this was based on the government's own data. And they never recovered from that. And Judge Grisey wrote a scathing opinion, but not an intemperate opinion, saying there was no basis for the government's claim that you could build this. And then another strange thing happened. The Federal Highway Administration was added to the papers by the plaintiffs, the opponents, and they said, we want a trial. That's insane, okay? Why they wanted a trial, it's not clear, but things only got worse. And so in a second trial, it came out that there was some basically lawyer, it's hard to imagine, but some of the lawyers actually passed along what were really false claims and people knew to be false. And Judge Grisey became quite incensed. And then it also was revealed that there had been misleading averaging of fish, where basically the fish were really clustered right in the pier area, and it had been averaged into some areas where there were no fish. So even though the EIS showed impacts, it actually skewed them to look more favorable to West when they should have. And he wrote then a blistering opinion, leading people to say that he had overreached, and that's when people started saying he's a hostile judge. But what he found and what came out in the court was quite problematic. So what happens then? Well, then it gets there's never an end to regulatory battles. And this was sent back. Well, actually, it was appealed to the Second Circuit, and the Second Circuit, the judges affirmed Judge Grisey's opinion, saying it was well-founded. Then there were two state and a federal investigation that found things were worse than Judge Grisey had found. Okay? Governor Cuomo's investigator, Thomas Puccio, of the Abscam inquiry. Any of you saw The American Hustle? That was based on the Abscam story. Thomas Puccio was hired by Cuomo as lieutenant governor, finished when Cuomo was governor, and he was asked to look into this. And I'm not sure what Governor Cuomo expected, but Puccio said Westway should not be built. New York can't afford it. This project doesn't make sense, and there should be investigation of all these irregularities. And that's what all of the investigations found. So, but there was a remand. They had a chance to get it right. And what happened here is, I don't know what I just did. Well, now you get the highlights. So what happened then is actually oh no, I have to go back. I have to show you Mitchell Bernard. So I don't know. Can you fix that from your end? Okay. There we go. Let's see. I'm not sure which direction I go in now. Okay, that looks familiar. Let me start again. Okay, hold on. So several things happened during 1982 to 84, and I can't possibly do justice to them. Maybe the best value of the book is I really was able to get to the innards of what went on in the regulatory battles, which is stuff that normally never sees the light of day. And so, because normally these things are subject to various privilege claims, and because, as someone told me at EPA today, said, you might have noticed some documents came out that normally wouldn't come out. But they decided not to oppose revealing some documents that essentially revealed the infirmities of the project, even though they could have been withheld. And that was very true. But there were two efforts. There was an effort to shorten new scientific studies by Governor Cuomo. He succeeded on that front, shortening what was supposed to be 2 years of studying down to 4 months. Okay? He also, through the law firm, also tried to hold on a second. Let me just get the exactly right. Hold on. Oh, by the way, I should tell you that Judge Grisey was described as having echoes of Torquemada in him. Who was a Spanish inquisitor. So I left out that good little quote. 1 second. And so in this time, this is when the pro-Westway rider was attempted, and they tried to get it through, and that was defeated too. So you ended up having a shortened study, this effort to basically declare the game over and have Westway just guaranteed. That didn't succeed. And then, so the process continued. A draft environmental impact statement came out, which ties into the Clean Water Act permit. And it said, basically, this will cause potentially irreversible declines in the fish. It will cause significant adverse impacts for striped bass fisheries. It could lead to long-term harms and declines in the population. And then in accompanying press statements, the Army Corps official had even stronger language. This is extremely important habitat that needs to be protected. And people thought that probably meant Westway was dead, because you can't, under the Clean Water Act, you cannot build in water if you will have a significant adverse impact on an important aquatic environment. You also can't build in the water unless it's water dependent, and people kind of blasted past that. But the third is, if there's uncertainty about the science, it also has to be denied. And so this project, based on these statements, Westway appeared to be dead. But a few months later, the final environmental impact statement came out, and it completely reversed course. And it said all the words of significant were gone, and it basically eliminated all of the language with no explanation whatsoever. And so then what happened? Well, once again, actually, the United States realized it had a little problem and did not oppose having another trial before Judge Grisey. They tried to limit the trial this time, but they realized there was a need for a trial because there was no record justification for these changes between the draft and the final. Mitchell Bernard took over for Al Butzel at this point. He is now the Director of Litigation for the Natural Resources Defense Council and widely viewed as perhaps America's best environmental lawyer. But there are many who might take that claim, but a superb lawyer. So he took over for Al Butzel. He was a young lawyer at that point who did not have trial experience except for second seating, I think one other proceeding, and had helped Al Butzel earlier some. And a trial started up, and things did not go very well for Westway. And one of maybe the most enjoyable parts of the book for those who just want a good story is ultimately the United States had to rely on a witness named William Dovell. William Dovell was a private scientist lacking a doctorate who, in internal documents, his work had been described as without scientific basis by EPA and National Marine Fisheries Service. He also was someone who'd been paid for his work by George Lamb and a foundation attached to the Rockefeller interests. And still, he, in the end, was presented in this trial as the expert who had written the definitive report about striped bass in the Hudson. Now, I'm about to tell you how Mitchell took this person apart on the stand, but one question is, if this person fell apart and that killed the project, why should we care? But one thing to think about is this was a multi-billion-dollar project. Okay? There was money flying all over. I think the only way to think about it, this was the best scientist they could find who would testify that Westway would have no significant impacts. I cannot find another explanation for it, but what happened ultimately is, for New York buffs, as you must be, Randy Mastro was a young U.S. attorney. Okay? His witness was William Dovell. Okay? And Randy Mastro was deputy mayor under Giuliani. He just wrote the report about Governor Christie, that Governor Christie had nothing to do with the shutdown of the GWB. He also is the lead lawyer who's been working for Chevron in Texaco and got the multi-billion-dollar verdict reduced for the impacts in Ecuador, which has been, there's a big story about in Times and earlier in the New Yorker. But at that point, he was a young lawyer. And what proceeded to happen was every lawyer's nightmare. Okay? It turned out Dovell was not just probably a not very good scientist, but one of the world's worst witnesses. And he ended up being extremely sure and said, I have developed a model that explains the striped bass movement. And in the end said, and I talk about it in my report. And it turned out the report didn't say, first of all, what was claimed. And that the report actually conflicted. It seemed to say in several places that Westway shouldn't be built. But and after it was 3.5 days of nonstop cross-examination, the government knew they were in trouble when the following became the circumlocutions. That Deauville said, "I did not agree with that when I wrote it." And Judge Grisey said, "Can you read that back?" And he said, "I did not agree with that when I wrote it." And they inquired, and Judge Grisey said, "Wait, are you saying?" And he said, "That's right, because of the editing process, I was putting things in that I didn't agree with at the time," and which is a little bit hard to fathom. But it was extremely confusing testimony. But Mitchell Bernard went through and really very much showed the report, and actually several subsequently real draft reports that came out, to lack a basis. And at the end of that, there really was not much left standing. And then the very end, and I'll just open up to questions after I talk about the lessons of it. So what happened next? So it was appealed. The Second Circuit was waiting for decision. Everyone raced to Washington, right? So opponents wanted to kill the project yet again. Supporters wanted to get the guarantee of the project or an extension. But this project was viewed across a lot of the country as a pork barrel and boondoggle that was too expensive. And so of about 4 different legislative bills, one in particular ended up being debated actually on the floor of Congress, and that was a proposal to cut off, with some wording, but basically to cut off work, or the ability of people to work on Westway. And so people were debating it on the floor, and I know that Marcy Benstock was there, and I think other opponents in the gallery looking down. And as they were debating on September 11th, 1985, the Second Circuit's ruling came out upholding Judge Grisey's striking down of the permit under the Clean Water Act. And then Congress and people said, should we stop? Should we keep going? But they voted, and 2-1, Congress voted to cut off funds for Westway. Okay? And a few weeks later, New York and New York City traded in Westway funds for mass transit, a replacement road, bike paths, and then ultimately, subsequent developments, not all this money, but led to Hudson River Park and other things along the west side. But the project was defeated, and actually, in the end, it was a complicated form, but more money went to mass transit than actually initially expected. And so, so I said at the beginning there are these competing claims. Okay, so one of them was democracy frustrated. Okay, the reality is this was a battle that had substantial political coalitions on both sides. That was very much split, even at the politician level. If you look at the votes in Congress, the rider failed to build the project. Congress voted 2-1 to knock it down, and 3 laws remained in force, and they were enforced, which obviously is the face of democracy. Second, environmental laws gone wrong or right. This proposal had substantial air problems that were fixed, and it had substantial water impacts that were shown again and again and again. And so this was not a battle about nothing. But I told you there was also this line about it being a procedural snafu. Okay? And part of the story there is, for inside poker for lawyers, was the story this was just a battle about NEPA, this environmental impact statement law, which is not substantive. Normally what it is it basically says you have to be honest in your disclosure. But the Clean Water Act is substantive. And significant harms to water and uncertainty about harms to important aquatic habitat require a permit denial. This was a substantive infirmity, and this was not a procedural flaw. Okay? And that story is wrong also. And then lastly, is this something that shows citizens doing good or bad? I didn't give you all the ins and outs of the politicking here, but although federal regulators and scientists provided things like the NIMF's statement about fishery impacts, and they were critically important, the political appointees kept at the last second capitulating. Okay? The only reason they were able to be used was citizens and their lawyers were able to go to court and show that this was illegally granted. And so there too, if you think the laws should be made real, in this instance, without the citizen litigants here, this project would have been built because nobody could have challenged it. The book closes by talking a little bit about the law today, and I show how it would be harder today to fight a project like Westway, but I think given the particulars of Westway under the law and the regulations, it still would be an extremely uphill battle if someone today tried to build it, but it's much harder today for citizens to get into court. The Supreme Court has made substantial barriers for litigation by citizens, and that's a big issue. It probably, in this instance, people could have gone to court, but some would have been denied what's called standing. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to, given that some of you lived through this and have questions or corrections. Yeah, go ahead.
I count as a big benchmark of my entry into adulthood Ed Koch's betrayal of my vote. I voted for him rather than Cuomo because he was an opponent of Westway. I live in the catchment area, I guess you could call it, where Westway would have been, where the West Side Highway is now. And our very nice park is starved for funds. And, you know, we had air rights being sold, et cetera, you know, bake sales, you know, to try to support this park. Do you think that the park, that was part of the plan, I mean, I'm still very happy that I got my wish and that Westway was defeated, but do you think that that park under the Westway scheme would have fared better than the Hudson River Park we have today in terms of funding?
The short answer is I don't know. I mean, I'd say this, that first, you know, it is the case all over the United States. When you look, big projects tend to be touted by people. There's a lot of political payoff in building big projects, and all across the country, things end up being starved and fighting for funds once built. And so that was part of the battling, and there's many file cabinet of memos of the Clean Air campaign over some of these issues, because the opponent said, even if this is paid for in the construction, New York State and City will be paying for this park forever, and when things get tough, will the money be there? You know, this will be a financial drain. And they also pointed out infrastructure for all that real estate development would cost something too. So I'm not sure. You know, but it is the case that there's a substantial literature in law and political science and economics where people look at things like this, and there's this tendency to get the big credit, the big splash, and then for projects that are supposedly maybe the public good side of a private project, they end up being neglected. So I think people had reasons to be skeptical, but the particular politics then and now, I don't know. I'm not sure. So, yeah.
You've already talked about the role that the editorial pages and op-ed articles played, but from your studies, how were the news articles in newspapers? Do you feel that they gave a straight treatment of the issue?
I'd say the following. There's actually, it ended up being interesting. So the Village Voice was probably the most constant reporter of the New York City papers, but the pieces tended to be strongly editorial in tone. I mean, but they did have a lot of good data in there. The New York Times reporters, the news reporters, their stories tended to be very good, very thorough. There just weren't a lot of them. So there were big gaps of time where there wasn't much reporting by the news reporters. This was covered nationally. There were some very good articles in the Washington Post and a few other places. In the late days of the battling, the best reporting was in the Newark Star-Ledger by a guy named George Lenahan, I believe, if I have the name correctly. I'm not sure if I have the first name correct. But he was following what was going on. But the reason I say it's hard to answer this is one of the side stories here was Sidney Schanberg was an op-ed columnist for the Times, and he began to write pieces that, while they had an editorial tone, were also reporting the news that was not appearing in the Times. And so you ended up having increasingly strident op-ed pieces with lots of news about what was happening that weren't in some of the New York Times stories, at least not on a timely basis. And then at the same time, the editorial board of the New York Times was writing things like, it's hard to figure out what so incensed the judge. And saying about the appropriation rider, this would build striped bass useful habitat. That was build the striped bass a fish town of their own. I mean, so you had a clashing of the two. And so it was more the intermittency of the reporting. Some of the best kind of retrospective reporting was by reporters at the New York Times who every few years would do kind of, how did we get here in this 14-year battle? But you know what happened with Sidney Schanberg, some of you know, because I know some of you worked for newspapers, but Sidney Schanberg wrote a column called Of Cajun Flies in Westway, and that said basically the following: if you think the stink in a celebrity chef's kitchen that was just shut down is bad, you should go down to the federal courthouse and smell what's going on here, because he had been there when some documents came out from EPA that, for example, one of the documents that was probably revealed by people who thought it should see the light of day was by a high-up person at EPA saying of the regional administrator, when EPA was objecting to the project, the memo said, Daggett, the regional administrator, doesn't seem to have gotten the message, nothing will kill Westway faster than a letter like this. And so he reported that in this Cajun Flies in Westway piece, and the New York Times took away his editorial, his column right immediately afterwards. The Times didn't say it was, it's kind of like recent things at the Times. They didn't say it was related to that. Sidney Schamberg will not say it was because of that, but other news organizations did. So NBC had a news story about it and said it was silencing, one of the voices of conscience in New York. And so it was. So I would say it was. You're looking at. I mean, there was a lot of interesting, important. I mean, without the newspapers, there were lots of political gaps I never could have filled in. But there were a lot of gaps, and so I would find things going on the regulatory front for months at a time with not a story in the major newspapers. So it was a mixed bag. So yeah.
Two questions. One is a little asking about a postscript. Was the money that we eventually got from mass transit funds largely responsible for the turnaround of the subway system that we experienced beginning in right around the time Westway was killed and transit funds were acquired? That's question number one. Question number two is a little more cynical. And having some familiarity with these sorts of battles in New York City, it seems to me that a lot of opponents to projects tend to have mixed motives, and I have no doubt that many of the opponents to Westway were sincere in their feelings that this was an environmental problem, travesty, right? But I'm also fairly suspicious that a lot of people use the environmental club as an excuse to oppose this because they had other more NIMBYistic motives for opposing it. And if that's true, could you go into what those things were?
Okay.
Anti-development, anti-traffic, anti-whatever.
Okay, well, I guess first, on the money, there were two big things that happened. One is there was a large bond for transit that was passed right before Westway was defeated. So you had a big influx of money that came in over a period of time from the Westway trade-in, and you had new bond that gave greater money. And according to other people I talked to, said that part of it also was the MTA just got better management. Some people who knew how to stage complicated, large-scale projects, and so they improved in their professionalism. So I would say it was a combination of things. But remember, a bond is borrowing, right? We all pay, and the trade-in was just an influx of money, largely for transit. And so, for an embattled New York City, that was, essentially a freebie, whereas the rest was New York borrowing in ways that we'd all pay for. On the kind of the NIMBY, not NIMBY, what were the motives? Several things. One is internally. To give you an example, the reason I'd say that, I'm sure there probably were some people who didn't like the idea, of living over here and having a decade of construction. So absolutely. But the opposition was far greater than just people who were the neighbors. Okay, so, and the opposition included internally within, say, the Koch administration, the deputy mayor was Robert Wagner, and he was asked to write a memo, basically, should we build Westway or not? And he came out and said, no, we shouldn't. He said, mass transit is far more important to New York's blood, and its vitality than is a highway, and that we should, now that we have this trade-in option, that's the better choice. He said, Westway is a good development project, but transit's more important. And many other people said the same thing, including some prominent development people, Seymour Durst and other people, thought that, that Westway was bad for business interests. And so it was a mixture. And then on the environmental front, a lot of the people who were worried about the environmental issues had no direct, immediate impact issues. They looked at this as having major air impacts in a city that was suffering from serious air pollution problems and water impacts. And so, I was really quite struck by that. I thought that I was going to find a lot more in the way of kind of opposition being of small numbers, but in fact, in the government documents, you found lots of concessions that this project was a problem and not building it might be the better choice. Puccio, for example, when he wrote his report for Governor Cuomo, said Westway is a luxury we can't afford and we shouldn't build it. He didn't even have environmental interest on the scale. Okay? That wasn't even part of his analysis, and he said still Westway was a bad idea. And so that was an interesting and kind of surprising thing to find. So again, I think like any coalition, you're going to have many people with many different interests. I will say this, that one curious thing, some people said to me, they didn't care about the fish. And I felt like, and to my sense here is, no one ever said it was just about the fish. You know, this was about transit, air impacts, a vision for the city, should highways or subways be built generally, and people were concerned with the environment. And so it was like any complex political regulatory battle, it was a coalition of interests that ended up defeating this. But remember, the main story, the prevalent story is this was an anti-democratic, it was like, one person and one wayward judge. And that's just simply not borne out by when you look at the materials. Yeah, in the back.
My name is Paul Willen. I'm an architect. And I was involved in what may in fact be a footnote to this, but I'm not exactly sure. A alternative plan was developed by John Bell and myself, which was to develop a boulevard where the boulevard has been developed, and to have a linear park between that boulevard and the river. And that proposal was widely disseminated in 1980 and published in the Voice.
Yeah, actually, the book talks about that. I just didn't include that here. So yeah, absolutely. It's a must read. It's one of the best parts.
As you usually know, what motivated us was the mammoth size, or our opposition to Westway, was the mammoth size, the lack of scale, the overwhelming impact it was going to have on the grain of the existing city. It was, as architects and urban designers, that we came up with this alternate proposal which was in scale and which we believe would generate development on a very large scale, which has in fact happened inside West Street.
Sure.
And it did enter into, I guess you covered this, the legal battle in the sense that they were faulted under the environmental law in not examining this alternative.
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, your point is a good one, and this is actually one of the places where Judge Grisey, he unexpectedly ruled in the Mitchell-Bernard stage of the battles that the alternatives analysis was inadequate. And that was one of the reasons, and actually John Bell, I think it was John Bell, was a witness at the trial for a short time to talk about this as an alternative. This project, the only way they were able to claim it had to be in the water was by saying, there was internal skirmishing among the agencies. They're saying, why does this have to be in the water? And they had all these meetings, explain again, and there were memos flying back and forth, and they said it was because it was a highway, real estate, and park project, and to fulfill all three goals, including minimal disruption for the immediate neighbors, that this was the best project. So it ended up being, but the law is quite clear, you're not supposed to build in water if there is an upland alternative. And so that was, I think frankly what's happening there is the Clean Water Act was relatively new, and now the law is quite developed. I think today people would say, a lawyer from King and Spalding, an environmental lawyer, said, the idea that you would try to build this much fill in the water would seem insane today. Like people would think that would clearly not be legal. But I think then that the way you think about that, people were just kind of learning the laws. They were new. But yeah, so that was an interesting part of the story for sure.
And incidentally, maybe you mentioned this, but the Times editorially was strongly in favor of Westway.
Yes, it was.
And ridiculed our report.
Yes. Yeah, it was
and we felt very good about that.
yeah, there yeah, so sorry. And Walter, your question.
So back to this gentleman's question about the motivation for the opposition and whether the environmental concerns are sort of real or just a pretext. Certainly within there's no question that the environmental concerns were real. The water ones probably more legitimate, more or greater concern even than the air ones, partially because cars were actually getting cleaner during that time, whereas fish were getting more plentiful. But I believe, and I'm wondering whether you conclude the same, that the existence of the trade-in alternative was probably the single biggest motivator for really creating the energy that was needed on the part of the opposition to fight this fight for 14, 15 years at great expense and great effort and against enormous political opposition. And I know that in EPA, the first regional administrator of EPA to consider this matter was Republican Jerry Hansler, who was appointed by Nixon in 75 or something like that. An air staffer came up to him and said, I'm briefing you now about this highway project. It's either build the highway or take the trade. And he had these environmental concerns, but here's the alternative. And the New York City subway system at the time was a disaster. And the regional administrator just sat there and instantaneously said, okay, let's go for the trade-in. And so I'm wondering whether you conclude the same, that the existence of the trade-in alternative really was a huge motivator.
Certainly, it was probably the greatest constant in the battles, you know, the highway versus mass transit. And I saw some of the names, some of the people I saw in some of the reports looking at the trade-in and transit issues for the region. And so I would say that was a constant motivator, but not the only one. And so,
and its end, the fact that it had a deadline also created a...
That's right. There was this trade-in deadline, and so that's why it was such a dramatic ending, because it was trade in it or lose it. And so it was, you know, you couldn't have written it better if you wanted to come up with a crazy ending, and that was, there was that squeeze. They had to trade it in or give up on the trade-in. Any other questions? Well, listen, it's, as I've said to others, this book, it's either, here's the reason why you obviously need to get the book, because it's either a thrill, right? It's just a great read, or it's boring as hell and you will sleep like a baby. And so either way it's a win-win, okay? So I just want you to realize you just can't go wrong for that reason. But thanks for being here, and have a good night.
Thank you for making it here tonight as the rain starts. And we do have quite a few other people who had signed up to come, so we will start, and I think probably some people will show up a little bit late, but I'll take the opportunity to introduce myself to you, because I don't see a lot of faces of people who are regulars. I'm Carol Willis. I'm the founder and director of the museum and the curator for the exhibitions. I'm an architectural and urban historian, and someone who really cares about the way that cities are shaped through time. So I'm very interested in tonight's talk and Bill Buzbee's talk, but I know that a lot of you here have lived those battles and lived this history, so I don't want to interpose too much in terms of an introduction, other than to welcome you to the museum and to say that if you haven't been here before, as I know some of you haven't, we have been here in the space for 10 years. We do a couple of exhibitions a year on topics that are about the history of New York. The one that preceded this, which is about the super slender, ultra luxury towers that are going up around 57th Street, and if you're a downtown resident at 56 Leonard Street in lower Manhattan. This particular exhibition looks at contemporary topics, but the Woolworth building was our previous show where we celebrated the centennial of the Woolworth. So the museum likes to take topics which are the history of New York, international topics, the history, and also the future of the skyscraper. So I invite you back to see these other shows. The next one, which opens at the end of June, is called Times Square 1984, where we will revisit Times Square 30 years ago and the battles that were waged then about the proposals for skyscraper towers and the reactions of regulators and protesters that changed the trajectory of the planning of Times Square. So urbanism is really one of the topics that we like to look at in our exhibitions, in the book talks like tonight's. And let me mention the next talk scheduled for June 26th is the urban historian Donald Miller, who teaches at Lehigh University, and we'll talk about his a new book, which is, I think, just published, called Supreme City. It's about New York in the 20s and 30s. He calls it the Jazz Age, so you can come for that. But our topic for tonight is New York in the 1970s and 80s, and as you well know, because you're here, the battles over the future of this waterfront that we occupied landfill on at this very second, and that where we could throw a stone literally at West Street and what would have been Westway had things turned out rather differently. I think most of you, a lot of you know Bill Buzbee or were involved in these battles, but for the ones who are here just out of sheer scholarly interest and historical interest, Bill is a professor of law. Well, he was at Emory University in Atlanta on the law faculty but he's joining this coming September the law faculty of Georgetown University Law Center. And he is the author previously of Environmental Protection Law and Policy, and the editor of Preemption Choice, the Theory, Law, and Reality of Federalism's Core Question. He has published in many articles and in law reviews. And so apropos of introducing the topic of this evening, and something which I think is very resonant with the way that we look to tell the story of New York and the development of cities, I want to take one sentence from his introduction. And he says, "You cannot understand Westway or any other high-stakes regulatory wars if you ignore the law, especially differences among laws and how laws can be strategically wielded in light of underlying facts and science." And that's something I think which is too often forgotten by the participants in the battles as they're waged, or maybe in the reports or the histories that get written. But the law is at the basis of this, and so it's particularly appropriate and rewarding, I think, to be able to listen to a lawyer and someone who studied the history of law to be able to describe to us through his disciplinary lens what really happened in fighting Westway. So, Bill.
Thank you, Carol.